One of the things I'd really struggled with was working in institutional settings, in hospitals and in care homes, and seeing the way in which people with dementia were treated almost in the way that they weren't human, that they had no feelings, or that somehow what we said to them or about them didn't matter. It was almost as if they were of another species. And I think it was when Tom Kitwood first talked about malignant social psychology, which is the way in which we dehumanise people with dementia, and pointed out that that's not done because staff are bad people. It's done because of the culture of care that surrounds them. And so if you have an example of malignant social psychology, the most common one in the UK would be where you've got two members of care staff, person with dementia sitting in the middle, and the care staff are having a conversation over the top of the head of the person with dementia, as if they weren't there. If you're sitting there and grappling as a person with dementia with losing your identity and feeling very anxious and disorientated, and you can hear people using your name and maybe looking at you in quite a concerned way and then shaking their heads, and so you might not be able to exactly follow the gist of the conversation, but you know that at a fundamental level that you're being discussed as if you're not there. And we can imagine that if that sort of thing happens again and again and again, say 50, 60 times a day, then that can really start to increasingly eat away at somebody's sense of their self and their own psychological well-being. And so the malignancy that Kitwood described in that malignant social psychology was really about that, how the sense of psychological robustness gets eaten away, and how it just spreads from one member of staff to another. So you're a new member of staff in a facility, and that's the norm, then you do it. You don't do it because you're being cruel, you do it because everybody else does it. And it spreads very quickly from one member of staff to another member of staff. And before you know it, you've got a whole culture of care that, instead of being caring and supportive to the person with dementia, is actually undermining the very thing that that you want to do in healthcare. You want to help people feel better, not worse. And it wasn't really until I heard the late Professor Tom Kitwood speak at the end of the 1980s that I really started to think about working directly with people with dementia and their psychological problems and needs. And that was the start of a long association, both with Tom Kitwood and then the Bradford Dementia Group. The way in which Kitwood defined the experience of dementia is the one, I suppose, that I most often work from. At a brain level, you're dealing with neurological impairment. So when dementia first starts, you've got small changes to the thinking part of your brain. And as the dementia progresses, that damage gets greater and greater. And I suppose that's the fundamental process of a number of diseases that we know cause dementia. So primarily we think of Alzheimer's disease as being the main cause of dementia, but there are many others too, like vascular dementia or Lewy body or various other ones. But all of them have at their centre a progressive deterioration of brain matter. Often what we're dealing with as the dementia progresses is that past memories and experiences become much more present than more short-term memories. So, you might find yourself in a nursing home, and in your mind, actually, you're back in maybe the farm that you grew up on, and it's 4 o'clock in the morning, and you're thinking, what I need to go and do now is milk the cows. And if I don't get out that door and milk the cows, then there's going to be real problems. So, what people bring with them into the dementia is a whole set of memories and experiences by which they try to make sense of what's going on around them currently. I think one of the keystones to good dementia care is knowing as much as you can about a person's past history. And if that person has grown up in the same country as most of the people that are caring for them and has the same cultural touchstones, then in some respects it's easier to care, or it's easier to make sense of what they think is happening. I think the other issue, is that feeling of when any of us feel anxious or distressed, what we want around us is those things that make us feel safe and happy. And they're often cultural touchstones like music or food or a TV programme or just the sound of voices and accents that we're familiar with. So I think caring for people, in a transcultural way is a real challenge. It must make the experience of dementia much more frightening. And I guess that's the area. It's the social psychology. It's what is currently surrounding the person with dementia that is the area that I'm most interested in. It's how we ensure that the environment in which the person finds themselves is supportive of them rather than making them more confused and more anxious. Tom Kitwood was the first person to use the term person-centred approaches in relation to people with dementia. And that harks directly back to the work of Carl Rogers in person-centred counselling. And I think when Tom first used the term, it was to try and differentiate a way of working with people with dementia that was based on sort of Rogerian principles of authentic relationships, of emotional congruency and unconditional positive regard, and recognising that a person's reality was their reality and that was the starting point for working with them. And I think from then on, the term person-centred has come to represent all those ways of working with people in order to maintain their personhood. Personhood is a term we don't commonly use in the English language, but Tom Kitwood defined it as a standing or a status that is bestowed on one human being by others in the context of relationship and trust. So at the heart of it, I guess, with person-centred care, is seeing the person first, recognising that the dementia is part of their life and part of where they're at that point in their life. If we could work at making the social psychology for people much more supportive, then in some respects it looked like their dementia was getting better. And he first coined the term rementia as a way of suggesting that we could affect how confused or anxious somebody was simply by improving the social environment in which they found themselves. And that was a really hopeful message, I think. If we, as care professionals and practitioners and family members, if we recognise that actually we have a lot of power to help the person with dementia feel less confused, to feel safer and more secure, then it gives us a positive way of working rather than a sort of no hope and despair way of working. What I tried to do in my book and subsequent papers was to really try to think in very clear terms what it is we mean now by person-centred care. And I developed the acronym VIPS in order to help us remember the 4 essential elements of person-centred approaches. And the V stands for valuing people regardless of their intellectual capacity or their age or their ability. And a lot of the problems that people with dementia experience are because they're simply not valued by society. The I stands for individualised care, because obviously if you're working with people, you need to recognise that each individual is unique and that they bring with them their own set of strengths and needs. And Kit Wood certainly wrote a lot about that within his work, although it wasn't the defining aspect of person-centred care. The third part of the definition is the P, which is around taking the perspective of the person with dementia. So trying in our work, if we can't know directly, to try and make as serious attempts as we can to think about what does this feel like for the person with dementia. So what does if I'm a nurse, how are they perceiving what I'm doing? Where do they think they are? What sense is this person making of their world? And a lot of so-called challenging behaviours in dementia care are often because the person with dementia has in their head a perception that is not shared by others. And the final element, S, is around the social psychology. How socially supportive is the environment to the person with dementia. When you first start meeting people with dementia as part of your professional life, most students will say they're frightened. They feel very fearful of people with dementia. They don't know how to react or how to interact. And often that fear means that people avoid, so we try to not be the one who gets to deal with a lady with dementia. And I suppose my first piece of advice would be, just recognise that this is a person and they're struggling with neurological impairment. That's their disability. So it's really trying to let go of some of that fear and to recognise that you're working with somebody that's struggling very hard to understand what's going on around them. And that they are probably much more frightened than you are. And, if somebody was struggling to walk or had a disability that you could see in that respect, you'd lend them an arm, or you'd give them a wheelchair, or you'd give them some aid to help them. And for somebody with dementia, the greatest aid you can give them is by being with them and trying to communicate as clearly as possible and trying to listen to what this person's concerns are. So I suppose it's just practical things like, if you're trying to help somebody with dementia understand something that you need them to do, try to make sure there is as little distraction and background noise as possible, and make sure they can see you and that they can hear you. You may want to use touch, so touching somebody's hand to get their attention, using eye contact, making sure you look warm and welcoming and smiling, trying to get down to their eye level, don't stand above people. Recognise that you probably look pretty scary yourself, so trying to make yourself look approachable and ready to work with them. I suppose the other thing that I would look out for is trying to judge, if you can't really understand what the person's trying to tell you verbally, how do they look like they're feeling? Do they look frightened or anxious, or do they look cross, or do they look happy? And just feedback what you're seeing, so, good morning, Mrs. Brown. You look a bit worried, is there anything I can do to help? It's that sort of approach, rather than trying to get into a conversation about what somebody needs or what it is they're trying to say to you straight off. And as the person relaxes, often what you'll find is their speech becomes clearer. And so you start to meet person to person rather than both of you being frightened of each other. The issue of time, I think, is a very difficult one when you're a busy professional and you're rushing around and you've got this huge long list of things that you've got to do. When you are very busy, though, it's important to get into the habit of, if you've got to do a piece of work with somebody with dementia, you want them to, maybe you've got to do a procedure with them or talk to them in more depth, is to really try to consciously slow yourself down just before you go into that interaction with somebody with dementia. get your breathing level down, get your shoulders relaxed, and prepare yourself to work at a slightly slower pace than you would if you were working, with somebody without neurological impairment. And again, I think just taking those couple of moments before you rush in will often mean that your interaction goes more smoothly. By spending a little bit of time with somebody actually saves us quite a lot more time in the long run. If you're working with older people, one of the things that attracted me to that work in the first place was that you have to work as a multidisciplinary team. For older people have so many different health issues going on and health and social care needs that unless you work as a multidisciplinary team, the person's not going to be helped. If we are serious about providing person-centred care for people, we have to be very clear what the outcomes of that care are. Does it cost more, actually, if people live lives of less anxiety and distress? What does that mean for staff retention, staff turnover, staff injuries? I think it's very easy to point to the costs of having a well-trained workforce, but often less easy to spot the sort of softer benefits of having a well-trained workforce. I think it's very easy if you're an individual care worker to get despondent, though, about, well, if only we had more resources, we could do so much more. And I suppose what I try to encourage people to do is, every little bit that you do helps. It's how you get somebody out of bed in the morning, with a smile and with a humane touch. Doesn't cost any more money than getting them out of bed quickly and in a hurry, So I think we can only do what we can each do.
Beautiful view. I'll always remember the moment I fell for you. Such a beautiful view.